There have been reports of police beating war veterans during a peaceful protest in Boston. The demonstration was part of the Occupy Wall Street movement, which is aimed at big business and banks. The protests, which started in New York, are now countrywide. Now let's get more from RT's Lucy Kafana, who's closely watching the protests for us there. Hello to you, Lucy. So these reports we're getting from Boston, is it the first time police have used force there?
Well, it's the first time that police have used force in Boston, although unfortunately not the same can be said for the rest of the country. What we know about the situation in Boston thus far is about 50 to 100 protesters have been arrested. We heard reports of about 1,000 people camped out. There's actually been such a massive support for this movement in Boston that there were two separate camp areas where protesters were demonstrating. One of them got raided by the police this evening. We heard reports about police officers actually breaking down the tents, confiscating property. And as you mentioned earlier, the most, I guess, egregious act that we had witnessed was an actual physical confrontation between some former veterans of the Vietnam War. At least one of the gentlemen that we heard about was 74 years old. There's video of him getting actually violently beaten down by the police. Very, very unusual situation, and it's something that was actually very closely watched here in downtown New York City, where, of course, the original so-called Occupy Wall Street protest began, that, of course, RT has been covering since September 17th. Now, they were live streaming some of the action here. A lot of the protesters very outraged at the actions that were happening. Several have actually left New York to travel to Boston to show solidarity with some of the protesters out there. We do know that these, as you mentioned, these events, these protests are spreading throughout the country. There's a lot more support for it. And of course, it's not so much about the protest as the underlying economic situation that's leading to the conditions that are encouraging people to take to the streets. They are tired of what they call corruption in Wall Street, corruption in Washington. They feel like the economic system no longer represents them. And many of the people that I've spoken to here really just don't feel like it's a democracy. It's the kind of country that they thought that they originally were living in. People are trying to take a stand for what they feel is right. Whether or not that's going to be heard, of course, is a whole separate story. Now, we do know that these protests, as I've said earlier, are spreading. We do know that the police are far more aware of the fact that there is this discontent across the country. They're trying to be careful. But again, we do see instances like what we saw, for example, last weekend here in New York on the Brooklyn Bridge, where 700 protesters were arrested for marching on the bridge, an unprecedented number here in New York. And of course, this is spreading across the country. More and more cities seem to have their own so-called Occupy Wall Street moments that have sprung